Good morning, everybody, from Midtown Toronto on a relatively snowy day. This is, I think, our third day in snow. I was just talking to our esteemed guest, Professor Borhi, and they're getting the same weather down in lovely Bloomington. Before I introduce Laszlo and turn the Zoom event over to him, just let me say a couple of words about what we're up to here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. As many of you know, I'm Robert Austin. I'm the Associate Director of CERES and primarily a specialist on Central Europe, but most of the Balkans, as many of you know. And this is part of a series that we started in the fall. We started with a terrific conference in the fall, and Laszlo was there for that as well, where we were examining the centenary of the Treaty of Trianon. So we had two parts. We had a kind of academic panel in the first part, and then my colleague, Dr. Susan Papp-Aikler, organized a panel which brought in a whole bunch of different voices from the region regarding the implications of Trianon. But it was implications of Trianon outside of Hungary. So we had guests from the territories that had been part of Hungary prior to the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. And then we took a little bit of a pause, but then this semester we're launching a series, and Laszlo is the first part of the series, and his talk is extremely important. And it's based on some very new research that Laszlo has been working on over the past few years. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Susan Papp-Aikler is going to be giving a presentation Wednesday at 2. I'll put some of the details in the chat box later, so the link's all there for you. And then on March 5th, we're hosting Miklos Seidler, who's going to talk about interwar Hungarian foreign policy. And there'll be a couple of more events coming this term, everybody, so I'll keep you posted. But as I said, I'll put it in the chat box so you can decide to attend or not. Now, today is basically pretty straightforward. Once I introduce Professor Borhi, he's going to talk for 45 minutes, and then we're going to have our usual Q&A. That's what the chat box is for, and I'll manage the questions, and we have a pretty hard stop at about 12:30, everybody. But instead, for those of you who have come to an event that I've run, I'm not a huge fan of reading bios of people because bios are out there, and when someone like Laszlo Borhi's here, it's pretty easy for me, because we've been friends for so long, and he's had such an extraordinary impact on my life as a historian, because he's a specialist on Hungary. I teach Hungarian history, but I'm a non-specialist. My work, it works at undergrad level, et cetera, but I don't write very often the way Laszlo does. Now, I was thinking the other day, like, how did I meet Laszlo? And I remember I used to be in touch really regularly with one of the great historians of Hungary, István Deák, and regrettably I've lost touch with István, but we had a very deep friendship. And István was a regular visitor to the University of Toronto, and we always enjoyed his presentations, his humor. And I said to István once, I said, well, I'm going to invite someone else now, because I can't keep inviting István, right? So I said to István, like, who else could I invite? And he goes, you got to invite this guy Borhi. He's really terrific. And Laszlo came, we met, and we were friends in 5 seconds. We had a lot in common, and we always had a lot of laughs together. And he's come so many times to Toronto. And what always impressed me about Laszlo, and the students always had the same feeling, I've never been with anybody who has such encyclopedic knowledge, not just of Hungarian history, everybody, but of the spectrum of Central Europe, and not just domestic Central Europe, but also the perspective of foreign policy actors. If you haven't read Laszlo's book, Dealing with Dictators, okay, which is an incredibly enormous accomplishment, and it's something I go back to quite regularly, and my students consult, you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about, because I write history, sure, but most of the history I write now is more of the popular variant. Laszlo works like crazy in archives, and moreover, he's got the language skills to do it. So when you're working with a book by Laszlo, you're dealing with the way history is supposed to be written, which is through archives and painstaking work. And that's one of the features when you look at a book by Laszlo. You can tell it's painstaking. And we always used to joke, Laszlo would say, I'm never going in an archive again. And 2 months later, where are you? Well, I'm in the archive. He obviously can't let go of archival research. And we're all Laszlo, we're grateful for that, because you're doing the really heavy lifting, so that more kind of synthetic works in what I work on are possible because of the heavy lifting done by historians like you. So that's my formal introduction of Professor Borhi. Laszlo, under normal circumstances, we would have been together in the fall in Indiana for the conference on the collapse of communism. I'm hoping that happens next year, fingers crossed, whatever, touch wood. But we'll be together again soon, either in Toronto or Bloomington, or in where we meet quite often, Budapest. So Laszlo, delighted to see you. My regards to all your family, of course. And I turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us in Toronto via Zoom.
Thank you so much, Rob, for this opportunity for me to speak at this distinguished institution. I love going there, and I'm sorry that this has to be on Zoom. But what can we do? This is the way the world works right now. I have been working on a manuscript, a book project, for a number of years. And the purpose of that project was to look at how ordinary people, everyday average human beings, survive, behave, succeed in totalitarian, dictatorial, terroristic spaces that is under very, very difficult historical conditions. And I've chosen 3 case studies to look at this topic. One was the Hungarian Holocaust, which, as you know, was unfortunately one of the largest such horrendous events in the Second World War. 500,000 Hungarian people, Jews, were deported to Auschwitz. And I looked at the conditions of their rounding up, their ghettoization, their journey to the concentration camp, and then to look at the lives of those who were selected to live in these horrendous labor camps, which were really death camps. Labor camp, I don't think, is the appropriate term. And then liberation and what happened to them afterwards. The second one that I looked at was Hungarian Stalinism, the arbitrary rule of Rákosi's rule in Hungary, which was probably one of the harshest versions or incarnations of Stalinism outside of the Soviet Union. And finally, and this is the one the chapter or section of the book, which is quite sizable, I have to say, maybe even too big, was the Aerocross terror in Budapest that occurred in 1944 and 1945. During the siege of Budapest, the life and death struggle of the Red Army and the city's German and Hungarian defenders, the city's strategic bombing, and in the meanwhile, local Aerocross groups were able to terrorize a city of 1.6 million people. And these issues allow me to address some of the major topics that contemporary historiography looks at regarding the Second World War, totalitarian dictatorships, that is the phenomena of perpetrators, victims, bystanders, denunciations, rescue, solidarity, and selfishness, coercion, persuasion, barbarity, arbitrary rule, and the impact of all of these on survival. Recently, Holocaust scholarship has made a sharp turn to look at the mass killings that occurred on the Eastern Front after the invasion of Poland, partly in Poland and mainly on Soviet territory. And the focus of these researches was not just the behavior of the occupation troops and the local militias that helped them, but also the behavior of civilians in the Soviet territory, locals in Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, voluntarily massacred, and I have to say Romanians in Transnistria, voluntarily massacred their neighbors. Omer Bartov, the brilliant Holocaust historian, called it communal killings, and neighbors turned on neighbors, teachers on their students, customers on the shopkeeper, and so on. I could continue. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in such a way. But these killings happened in areas, remote areas of Eastern Europe, usually rural areas, that were economically backward, impoverished, and where there was a long-standing ethnic and religious strife going back perhaps hundreds of years, but definitely atrocities could be traced back to the First World War. What is amazing about Hungary, which was the brilliant Hungarian historian of California, Peter Kenny's, called in his book, recent book, was the last island in Europe for Jews to survive until the German invasion. There were 825,000 Jewish people living on Hungarian territory, Second World War Hungarian territory. In 1944, these people were very quickly deported by a puppet government. But in addition to that, and that is much less known, is that after the Arrow-Cross Party's seizure of power, former party veterans and adventurers, and others who joined them in October 44, started very similar killings that these civilians, peasants usually did in Eastern Europe. And it didn't happen in rural Hungary. It happened in the country's most westernized city. And in fact, amazingly, some of these mass executions occurred in front of the Hotel Ritz, which of course was the symbol of prosperity, culture, and middle-class life. Why did this happen? Who were the perpetrators? Who were the victims? How did the perpetrators behave? Why they committed these horrendous acts? And we have no definitive estimate of how many lives were lost. It's estimated to be 3,500. I have to say I've looked at reams of documentation. The final tally is almost impossible to come up with because there were so many individual instances. But I think that 3,500 is a good ballpark estimate. I think the numbers could go even higher than that. And even more amazingly, all this happened while the Red Army was in the close vicinity of the murders. And these murders were carried out not at the orders of the top party leadership, which the Arrow-Cross party leadership, Ferenc Szálasi and his cohort, fled Budapest before the Soviets surrounded it. And the party organizations of the party, which was a mass party, were left to their own devices. So this is, just like in Eastern Europe, a bottom-up violence, bottom-up atrocity, with no rational purpose. Because by that time, even the most dedicated Arrow-Cross men could visibly see that they have little chance of perpetuating their power. In fact, many of them believed that their chance would come after the war sometime and not necessarily. There were some illusions that the Germans will have their wonder weapon and still win the war, but most of them did not have that illusion either. So why did they do it? In their place, most people would have escaped. I mean, acting rationally, they would have fled the Soviets rather than fall into their captivity, but they did not do that. But in fact, they were bent on continuing their murderous rampage. Now, very quickly, I'll give you the historical background of this. Horthy's coup to jump out of the war failed. The Germans installed Ferenc Szálasi on October 15, 1944. And what is interesting for our purposes is that on that day, Arrow-Cross, who had actually been imprisoned under Horthy for a period of time, were all released from jail, and they were given weapons, they were armed, and they were tasked with defending Budapest against the Soviets, and in addition to that, round up deserters, and to take the Jews to the Budapest ghetto in assisting the police. And as I said, in the meanwhile, this was the worst siege outside of the Soviet Union in World War II. Fighting was literally carried out from building to building. Some buildings changed hands several times. The fighting was so tough. And all in the meanwhile, there was a strategic bombing with a lot of civilian casualties. So this was really a terroristic space. But terroristic space was also created by the arrow cross on a macro level. Buildings became terroristic spaces, so-called yellow star buildings, where the inhabitants are mostly or not fully Jews, arrow cross people, housekeepers, and inhabitants of the building terrorized not just the Jews, but also the Gentiles that sympathized with them. There was a nice couple, a mom and his son, Mr. Bumford, who ventured out on looting raids every night, and the miserable people who lived in their buildings would see that every night they returned with their clothing full of blood, and they came back with a lot of loot. Another woman screamed that I want to drink Jewish blood. Another one terrorized a Gentile housekeeper for being the hireling of the Jews. A certain Mr. Kemence and his family terrorized the whole neighborhood. So this was a space of fear and a space of terror. And this is my departure point. There was more or less anarchy. Police and other agencies that kept up law and order were collapsing very rapidly. And in fact, the arrow cross hated the police so much that they were also targets of their vindicative rampage, oftentimes. You might wonder what kind of sources I used. I used the sources of court documents and police investigations immediately following after the war, the so-called People's Tribunals. And I used the documentation of two large trials that are literally unknown, even in Hungary, let alone outside of the country. There was a big trial in 1965, the trial of the so-called Zugló arrow cross detachments. That has received some scholarship, and there was another one which has received literally none, except for a novel that was recently published, on the trial of the murderers of Buddha. That was the title of the proceedings. And these produced thousands and thousands of pages of survival testimony, perpetrator testimony, eyewitness testimony, all kinds of stuff. Of course, this has to be handled with great care because of the politicization of the trials in many, many ways, particularly by the People's Tribunals. That serves not just the purpose of serving justice, but also the purpose of legitimizing the communist takeover. Oftentimes, the defendants are not allowed to have defense witnesses. Sometimes these were kangaroo courts, but sometimes, fortunately, the judge, and this is individual agency, was really interested in what happened. And ultimately, finally, I remembered to say that one of the biggest things I was interested in this project was agency, individual agency versus structure. What is more important? Can there be elbow room? Can there be latitude for personal decisions, right or wrong, in conditions like this, whether it's in an arbitrary rule under Stalin, whether it's in a Nazi labor camp and death camp, or whether it was in Budapest in these cold days of the turn of 44, 45. What did they do and why is the next question I want to address to you. And these are my own findings. And I've spent a lot of time mulling over these documents to come up with my results. Very typically, and I just described one of these atrocities of which hundreds happened. The Arrow Cross Group, the 12th District Arrow Cross Group, attacked a building in Pest, otherwise the other side of the river, in Nagyatádi Street, and nabbed 60 people from a cellar. These cellars operated as safe havens from the bombings and the fighting. So the civilian population of the city was reduced to living in cellars for months. For some people, they were safe havens, but for others, they acted as torture chambers. Because the Arrow Cross in the buildings that they used, they took their captives to the prison, to the cellars, the coal cellars and wood cellars, and then they brutally tortured them. So they nabbed these 60 people. They took them to Andrássy Avenue 47, where they established themselves for a while. They had what they called a Reprisal Room, and that was a group of spaces which they used to beat up with truncheons, fists, kicks, bullwhips, bottles, the prisoners that they took in. And they beat them up so horribly that we can safely say that these were atrocities. And after that, when they took their valuables and humiliated these people physically and psychologically, it was their turn to be taken for execution. And the Arrow Cross justified the execution by saying that the police was supposed to round these guys up and take them to the ghetto, but oftentimes they just released them. So now we're taking things into our own hands. But rather than taking them to the ghetto where they were supposed to by law, actually, they took them to various execution sites. And there's a misperception that all of these people, and I have to say that majority of them Jews, but by no means all of them, there were many, many Gentiles also, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Some of them were taken to the Danube. Others were killed in bombed out spaces or parks or roads under the cover of the night. In fact, very close to where I live in Budapest, there is a park which had been a burial site and execution site. So it wasn't always the Danube. There were far more victims than the ones killed by the Danube. Recently in Holocaust historiography, there is a current an approach or interpretation that emphasizes the economic or financial motives of the Holocaust. I've always believed that this was a reductionist approach and doesn't explain very much. I always believed that National Socialist thinking, hatred, the politics of hatred, and as Daniel Goldhagen called it, eliminationist anti-Semitism, and not financial gain, was the ultimate cause of these events. And of course, it is easy to find evidence that there was a lot of looting, and there's no question about it. And I'll just give you one citation. One of these Arrow Cross guys, clad in uniform with an Arrow Cross armband, says, "Hey, we hit the jackpot. We brought in a chap who had 40,000 pengős, the Hungarian currency, on him." That was a lot of money at the time. And many, many instances like that. But the first thing that makes you wonder is that when a non-Jewish person was brought in, and it was established by so-called biological screening, whether that person was Jewish or Gentile, documentation was usually not enough, because the Arrow Cross knew that many of the Jews were supplied with fake documents. They looked at biological features to establish Jewishness. So if it was established that they were Gentiles, unless they were deserters or rescuers of Jews, after robbing them, extorting them, they would be usually released. Very few people of Jewish origins were released like that. So even a communist had a larger chance of getting released than a Jewish person. But I'll give you some quotes to underline what I'm saying. And this is from a man called József Hollós, who was executed in 1965 or 6 after the Zugló trial. And Mr. Hollós said in the proceedings against him, and I quote, "I was present almost everywhere. I saw and did things, but not for the money, not out of a desire to get rich, but out of conviction. There was a war, Jews were the enemy, and the enemy is always destroyed. I'm only sorry that we did not start earlier the liquidations of the Galicianes, a term used to refer to Jews, sooner. then there would be even less of them, but their turn will come again. Now let me quote from, I'm not sure, maybe from a book by Saul Friedlander, but I would not swear. But let me quote a police secretary from Vienna who explained to his wife in a letter from the Eastern Front that he was, and I'm quoting him, aiming calmly at the many women and children and infants with whom these hordes, meaning the Jews, would do the same, if not 10 times worse. Let's get rid of this scum that tossed Europe into war and is still agitating in America. I am actually looking forward to returning home. Then it will be the turn for our own Jews. That's the end of the quote. And in comparison, and this is striking, Mr. Vilmos Krösl, who identified as a German, by the way, claiming that Germans were superior to Hungarians and other races. Mr. Krösl, also in his trial of 1965, said the following: the struggle against the Jews was a matter of life and death. And I quote, he says, if we had not killed the Jews, they would have killed us. So this is very, very typical National Socialist thinking. In addition, if it was just about the money or pure sadism for the heck of it, why did they, and I have to say that these were not all veteran Aerocross. In fact, some of the veteran Aerocross were disgusted by this. One of them even went to fight at the front so as not to have to take part in the atrocities, but there were non-party members who joined in October 44, and we were even worse than some of the veterans. They targeted the offspring of Jews. So for instance, they attacked the convent of the Sisters of Divine Love, which gave refuge to about 60 to 200 people, most of them young or little girls, even infants. They nabbed most of them and murdered them. Only a few were able to escape. So these were little girls, not dangerous adults, dangerous quote unquote, but children. The other instance was the Salesian Institute on Bécsi Avenue in the 3rd district of Budapest, which was hiding young Jewish boys, despite the fact that the head of the convent, Mihály P. Kiss, was regularly tortured by the Aerocross men, whose headquarters were only a few yards away, and that's very perverse. And these were little boys ranging from 6 to 14, and they too, after so-called biological screening, were taken to the river Danube, and all of them, save for one who managed to jump into the icy Danube, and this is December, remember, colder than it's in Toronto right now, probably, was able to jump into the river, but the rest of the little boys were all massacred. In addition to that, they attacked hospitals with Jewish patients or Jewish hospitals. Obviously not people who were dangerous. Most of the infirm were shot in their beds. The others were lined up and executed. So I have very little doubt that the motive of the killings was eliminationist anti-Semitism. And again, I emphasize that having said that, there were also other targets. And very interestingly, and this is the notion of Judeo-Bolshevism that some of you may be aware of, Judeo-Bolshevism, this Nazi concept, that Jewishness and Bolshevism are one and the same. And this can be identified in the behavior of the Aerocross murderers in Budapest in 1944 also, which was infused with class resentment. So some of the Aerocross people later said that I joined the party, I signed up because I was somebody there. Another person said, I joined because they, the Jews and the other upper class people, look down on us. I'm a simple working class person, a woman, and they look down on us. So this was, class resentment was also a very powerful motive. And it's not a coincidence that in 1945, the newly established Communist Party made a strenuous effort, top-down effort, to recruit former Arrow Crossmen into their ranks because they understood this dynamic. And quite a few joined, I have to say. There were also, I have to say, and lots of political scientists look at such atrocities which are seemingly senseless and have no political purpose, no rational purpose. And they look at group dynamics, and group dynamics are very important. So, for instance, intimidation by the physically powerful members of the Arrow Cross reprisal units, incredibly sadistic people, even by the measure, the standards of their own comrades. And some of these Arrow Cross were younger people, 16, 17, who later credibly claimed that they were forced into participating in these murders because it was a pledge of loyalty, and also because they were told that they would be murdered if they did not participate in the killings. And even the communist tribunals sometimes were able to establish that some of these people felt genuine remorse for what they had done. Many of them were not remorseful at all, in fact, the opposite, as I pointed out, but there were a few, at least, who later felt some remorse and blamed it on the conditions, peer pressure, intimidation, and so on. And interestingly, the communist tribunals, as in West Germany, I have to say, treated some of these perpetrators almost like victims, claiming that they were victims of, in Hungary, I should say, for instance, raging Hitlerism. But this, I think, was a falsification, because these people, as I will show momentarily, had agency. They had agency. They had choices. And they were almost absolved of personal responsibility, but they did have personal responsibility. And as I will point out, they also knew right from wrong. So they claimed that this was for the Hungarian nation, the survival of the Hungarian nation. But they never talked, and when they were speaking to each other about the killings, really, they bragged about it, right? They said, how many kayaks did you kill today? 25, let's say. So it wasn't just, some of them said it was a huge psychological shock and they wept after the executions. But for many of them, it was almost fun. But when they talked to relatives, siblings, parents, children, or other civilians in the city, they never disclosed, never ever. One of them was injured at an execution. He accidentally got a shot in the arm or wherever. He was taken to hospital and they asked him what happened, and he lied about it because he knew that it was a crime. So it's not just that they were living in an old moral universe and had no idea about right and wrong. They did. They absolutely knew. There are universal moral values, and they knew that. So they were able to rationalize their acts, but they knew that what they were doing was wrong. The other aspect, of course, is the victim aspect. And many of you may know the famous dictum by Bruno Bettelheim that the Holocaust was so successful because the victims went to their death like lemmings. Now, of course, that has been debunked and denied by many scholars, but it still finds, this approach still has followers. Konrad Jarasch has recently reiterated this claim, almost going as far as blaming the victims for their own demise. I've looked at that both in my chapter on the Holocaust and in this Arrow Cross chapter that I'm telling you about right now. And here is my position. Number one, deception. Crazy as it may sound, I have firm documentary evidence that even after their beating and torture, most people believed that they would be taken to the ghetto. They had no idea that they would be massacred, that anyone would want to kill them. After all, they took their valuables, their coats, everything they had. And the Arrow Cross made a point of deceiving them. It's just like the people who deported the Jews from various parts of Europe. They never told them that you're going to die. When they took them in Hungary, they told them, oh, you're going to work in Kecskemét. You're going to work in the Great Plains. You're going to pick peaches. Or we're taking you to Germany, and the Germans will even pay you for your labor. So they never told them, obviously, what would happen. And when these people, and you have to look at the situation in which these people are taken to death. So number one, they don't know until the very last moment, until the arrow cross lined them up at the place of execution and killed them. They don't even tell the Gentiles they would be murdering. And they went after deserters and, as I said, rescuers, to a great extent. They didn't tell anyone. In addition to that, by the time they were marched to their destinations, these people were psychologically and physically abused. And I really, if you have a question about it, I can describe these atrocities in much greater detail, but I want to spare you of the details. These are very, very difficult to read. But believe me that this is the bottom of hell. I mean, what these people had to go through was incredible in every sense of the word, psychologically and physically. Some of them watching their little children being clubbed to death, or children seeing their parents being clubbed to death. And they were taken in scant clothing. So after terribly being beaten up, being hungry, thirsty, not getting fed, or bloodied up, broken limbs, some of them people very old, didn't matter, gender didn't matter, age didn't matter, oftentimes even race didn't matter. It was terribly cold. It was minus 20 degrees. And they only had their underwear on, oftentimes barefooted. So when they jumped, some of them were able to escape by jumping into the Danube, because the water, even though icy, was warmer than the air. And in addition to that, two aspects. So they were tied together by hands. So they were marched in columns of 2 or 3 or 4, and the hands were tied up. So even if somebody wanted to run, and you would only run because they told them, look, if you try to run, we'll shoot you. So it's the situation where you only make a run for your life if you know for sure that you're going to the death. And most people didn't know. They would, well, we could survive the ghetto, but we will not survive if we try to run. But even if they wanted, it was very hard, because unless, and some people were able to loosen the strings and run away, most couldn't. Most of them couldn't. Plus, I looked at the ratio of armed guards and these unarmed, miserable people. And believe it or not, they always made sure there were 2 or 3 guards, only 2 or 3 prisoners for one armed guard. And finally, the guards are very harsh, so they never ever let them go. Never ever, almost never. I mean, there were a few occasions where they did. Personal acquaintances, they sometimes would let go. But if they were strangers, and most of them were, they would not let them go, either out of the fact that they wanted to kill them and rob them, or they were afraid of doing so, that they themselves would be shot for allowing somebody to be released. So it was a hopeless endeavor, really, and there were people who were able to run away or jump into the river, but very few indeed. And that's simply because of the conditions, not because they waited their fate like lemmings, that they had no individual will. Of course they did. They did not resign themselves to their fate, so that's a lie. That's a simple lie. Anybody who says that is simply lying and falsifying sources. Even though there were escapes, and it has to be said, and that will take me to the next part of the talk. Escape was often a collaborative effort. So one of the questions I asked, was there any solidarity? And fortunately, my finding is that there was. So many people, even strangers, were willing to help. So when somebody escaped, let's say they jumped into the river, they were able to stay. Obviously, they didn't let them go. They tried to shoot them in the river, but some people were able to swim ashore. They needed somebody to give them warm clothing. They needed somebody to give them food and shelter, someone to take them to hospital or a Red Cross station. And that happened. I know of an individual personally who was helped out by a policeman he found a shelter in a stranger's home who fed him and gave him blankets, and then they called the ambulance. The policeman helped him get into the ambulance and be taken to a hospital. And from there, he was taken to the Red Cross. So quite a few people collaborated to save one person. And so they did resist. And when they could, these people did try to escape. They did try to resist. So there are many instances when they did that. And they were actually trying to hide, by the way. They were trying to find fake documents and so on and so on. That takes me to the question of denunciation, resistance, and rescue. And this story I found particularly sad. A boy called Gyula Merlin was denounced for failing to enter the Hungarist Legion. The Hungarist Legion was an armed militia established by the Arrow Cross to fight the Red Cross, and they impressed into this Hungarist Legion literally unarmed, miserable civilians that they rounded up in the streets, and as they themselves put it, we sent them to the butcher house. And this young man of 18, he was shot by the Arrow Cross because he failed to enlist. And he was denounced by an Arrow Cross man called Gyula Regensburger. And it was done purely out of ideological zeal and conviction. It was a completely senseless murder. And there were many like that. Both denunciation and rescue became social phenomena. Both of them in Budapest, I think, it is my conviction, a social phenomena. What makes this difficult is that the kinds of documents that exist are not mirrors of rescue, because obviously these people were interested in finding perpetrators, the guilty people, and they were not interested in finding out about rescue. That was not the purpose. But even so, by the way, the survivors or eyewitnesses discuss this phenomenon, not the way I would hope it would be discussed in a very deep way, but as part of the narration that they tell about what they went through or what they did or what they saw. So this is not very easy to research. What I did find is that literally all social layers were involved, including the lower social classes. For instance, a 60-year-old carter called Gustav Tavos was severely brutalized for failing to disclose where he got the fake documents for the Jews that he was hiding. The 70-year-old Ferenc Szobor, who was a so-called house commander, was beaten to death for failing to disclose where Jews were hiding in his building. And there were quite a few instances like that, where somebody risked their life, and it was Arrow Cross decreed by the Arrow Cross that such acts were punishable by death, felkoncolás in Hungarian. From a hindsight, sitting in a comfortable armchair, it's not always easy to see how brave or even sometimes heroic these acts were, because they seem to be trivial. But for instance, I'm quite sure that a tram driver who denied an order to go over with his train or tram over 25 disabled children that the Arrow Cross lined up on tracks risked his life. I mean, life was worthless. He could easily have been shot, but he didn't do it, fortunately. There was a family, housekeepers, who, despite getting death threats from the Arrow Cross, fed the Jewish families in their house. They shopped for them, and they brought food, and they fed them. Architecture. And there's a lot has been said about Poland, and I don't want to go into that. In Budapest, it was difficult because of the architecture. And those of you who know the city's architecture will know that most of the tenement buildings, first, number one, there are very small spaces, kitchen and room, as we called it, szobakonya, kitchen and room. There are open courtyards, open corridors, sometimes with shared facilities. So everybody knew what was happening in the house. So if somebody took in a persecuted person, whether it was a Jewish person or family or a deserter or somebody else, it was likely that other people who lived in the house would know. So you needed at least the tacit cooperation of those people for this rescue effort to be successful. And many times, not only was it that common people took in, and sometimes these were wealthier people with larger apartments, or less wealthy people with smaller apartments, but there were some people who found space not just for one family in their own, or accommodated one individual family in their own space, but they put in a lot of effort to find others a safe refuge with their friends or acquaintances. So this, again, a collaborative effort, which is very difficult to do in practice, if you look at it. Of course, the unfortunate part is that many of these people who put somebody up in the house's cellar or their own apartment or somewhere else were denounced, and the motive of denunciation is often not known. It could, of course, be sheer anti-Semitism or resentment or the motivation of financial gain, or in some instances, very mundane reasons like jealousy. So these people usually did not take into account the consequences of what they did. And one individual, and I talk about this individual momentarily, was denounced out of jealousy. Everybody knows about Oskar Schindler, and I don't have very much time, but I will finish momentarily, few minutes, to leave time for your questions. Oskar Schindler, of course, is well known, but I know of three individuals in Budapest who ran their factories and made a point of hiring people who were so-called persecuted at the time, Jews and others, to provide them safe havens. So they got paid, they got work, and they got protection. And one of these cases shows how chaotic these times were, and also that these documents that we have are sometimes leave ambivalence, so we don't know anything for sure. Oftentimes somebody was denounced for a crime against humanity, and that person found many witnesses who would claim at the court that no, this guy, I owe my life to this person. This person saved me. And one of these individuals, and he can be quite well documented, was a guy called Oskar Brunner. He was a member of the 12th district group, but he had his factory on the pest side in the 13th district. And he employed dozens of Jewish women. Consciously knew that they were Jewish. His wife was Jewish. His girlfriend was also Jewish. And he put them up, gave them a salary, and they gave them work and gave them protection. And he was known to be somebody who was a social democrat of left-wing conviction, who hated the Nazis, hated the Germans, and even helped share out fake documents to people who were hounded by the Arrow Cross. And he was denounced, and probably denounced by one of the women who worked in the factory. And the motivation was probably jealousy, that she was not in a position to be this man. So he was a very good-looking person, also quite prosperous. Probably turned her down, and that's why he denounced him and everybody he protected. So it's a very long story and a complicated one. In a nutshell, he was taken down together with his proteges to the so-called Arrow Cross house. He was badly beaten up. He was forced to perform horrendous, how should I put it nicely, intercourse with, that they did that a lot, the Arrow Cross. So they raped, beside torturing and beating, they also raped in a most horrendous way. And they forced their victims to carry out horrendous so-called intercourses in their presence while they were looking on, laughing. So he and his girlfriend were forced to do that. His wife was also rounded up, shot in the head, but survived. And then after this horrendous beating that he got and this humiliation, he was offered to join. Now, why he joined, that is the big question. But he did join, and he probably took part in some atrocities. Whether he killed anyone or not, they were never able to prove beyond doubt. But his motivation, he said, was that I had a daughter who was half Jewish. And they told me that if I don't join them and take part in the atrocities, they will bring my daughter in, and you know what will happen. Others claim that he did it because he wanted to save his factory, but I think the daughter is a good enough explanation. So this person was a rescuer, a victim, and a perpetrator all in one person. In 1945, he was tried, and he had so many Jewish witnesses claiming with an affidavit, hand signed, that we owe our lives to this person. That despite the denunciation which claimed that he took part in a murder, he was released. And it was alleged that he participated in the horrendous torture and execution of a soldier who was caught looting. And I read the details of the execution, you don't want to know. So there's ambiguity. Sometimes we just cannot reconstruct the events the way that we would like them. Who were these people? Scholars in Hungary try to categorize arrow cross party members through a social, historical, sociological investigation. If you look at the perpetrators, which was a tiny minority of the membership of the party, a few hundred people probably, we don't really know how many, 300, 400, 500 at the very, very most. There's no category that fits all. So these are not lumpen. What we need to know, these are not uneducated riffraff. Most of them are not. Most of them had decent education, by contemporary standards, regular education. Most of them were not from the lumpen proletariat. They were not barbarized in the war. I mean, none of them fought on the Eastern Front, so that's not an explanation. They came from different social classes. They were not maniacs. Most of them underwent psychiatric evaluation, and I found only 2 of them that underwent psychiatric care. Some of them were prosperous, some of them were not. Some of them went bankrupt in the Great Depression, some of them did not go bankrupt. Some were veteran party members, some were not veteran party members. Some joined out of conviction. So for instance, there was a guy called Miklos Tuboy, who, as he said, signed out of conviction to kill as many Jews as possible. Mr. Von Haas was animated by hatred, as he put it, and regarded his victims as personal enemies. Mr. Kreutz wanted to fight for a better future, and the obstacle, as he put it, were the Jews. And he was the one who later broke down and said that I was terrorized by these acts, I'm sorry, and it was accepted as a genuine. The evaluation was that this was a genuine expression of regret, but most of them did not do that, signed up out of conviction, hatred, and I emphasize hatred. But there were some like, what's his name? It doesn't come to me right now, but there was a guy who signed up. He was a middle-aged peddler, and he only signed up because he was told that he would get a disability pension. Another person took his 4 family down to join the party because he couldn't feed them, and the party gave them food. His daughters, his wife, and himself got a job and gave them food. So lots of motivation. Some of them were physically disabled. And one of these people, Mihály Halák, was one of the most incredibly sadistic people, even by the measure of his own comrades. He beat an art historian and his young son to death. He bludgeoned them to death. And when the father asked for mercy for his son, Halák told him, "You're not going to get a bullet because that costs 20 cents and you're not worth it." That was the response. So there were many, many people, and there's no generalization, no rule. I could not come up, I don't think anybody could come up, based on many, many cases, the review of many, many cases with any rule. And what is fascinating is that the vast majority of these people fit into post-war communist society very well. Many of them joined the Communist Party. Some of them, I mean, they became card-carrying members. And some of them were even decorated. And incredibly, one of the most sadistic ones was given an award for caring for the young, for caring for the youth. Another one for protecting the property of the people. And this guy had been a robber in 1944. But they were able, some of them who were not hung, and dozens were hung between 45 and 47. Many, many were hung, many, many. But some of them were released or not caught, and they were retried. So there's quite a few I could look at in this sense. There's no rule. And most of them succeeded in the new system, fit in very, very well, and were able to conceal their horrendous past for a long time until they were caught. Some of them were actually used. One of the most sadistic ones was recruited by the communist military intelligence, and that guy ended up in Australia, by the way. I want to quote, and I'm getting to the end, Zygmunt Bauman, who says that the lesson of the Holocaust is when in danger, people turn away from moral responsibility and choose self-preservation. And the arrow cross regime reveals that this was not a universal rule. The death toll could have been much higher had so many people not turned towards the moral responsibility. I have to say there was a lot of solidarity, and traditional ties like marital bonds held up very, very well. Many wives and husbands took great personal risk to solidarize with their partners. Some of them even went to death with their partners, and some of them rescued them. There was a person who was a lieutenant of the Hungarian army, retired, whose wife, Jewish wife, was taken to the 3rd District Arrow Cross. He donned the uniform, he stormed in and brought her out. And that was very risky, I have to say. He could have been shot easily, but he did it for the wife. So that held up very, very well. And what about agency? I mean, these were terrible times. People did not have a choice, but they did. And out of the very, very many, I'll give you, just to conclude, a couple of examples. When the Arrow Cross executed, they always made sure that the people they shot were really dead. And the survivor, a woman, young woman, said that there was the volley, and then we all fell on the ground. I was alive, I wasn't hit. And she says, an arrow cross came up, he leaned to me, took out his gun, and fired 3 rounds into the ground and left. And that was on purpose. I mean, there was no way he would miss her. So there was a flicker of humanity, and that person decided that this woman shall live. So there was a choice. Another one. One of the most horrendous acts was the attack on the Jewish hospital in Buda in Maro Street, headed by one of the most notorious killers, Pater Kun, a Minorite monk, a sadistic killer and an anti-Semitic maniac. Some of the victims were shot in their beds, others were shot in the garden. There was a veteran and there was a survivor, a lady who was pregnant at the time, Veronika Schönwald, and she remembered that there was one Arrow Cross man, Lajos Sógor, who was a veteran, as I found out, and he did not allow pregnant women and women with small children to be shot. He locked them up in a separate room. They all survived. So even in this horrendous mayhem, there was a choice to spare somebody else. And this is what I call agency. And agency survives the choice to make the right choice, survived in all of the spaces, terroristic spaces that I looked at in researching this book. And this is where I will conclude, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions in case you have any. Thank you very much for your attention.
Laszlo, greetings again from Toronto. Thank you so much. As I told the audience at the beginning, your knowledge is encyclopedic, and I'm looking forward. Quick question: How are things with the book? How's it?
It's under review.
Out in review. Okay. And it's a big. Just to remind everybody, it's a massive work, correct?
It's 377 pages, but I cut it down by about 90 to make it readable.
Okay, that's
And
good.
it was all for the good of it. It's much better than it used to be.
Okay, excellent.
Hopefully, at least.
So when do you expect we'll see that book?
I'm told that next year.
Okay.
I'm hoping it's going to be next year.
Yeah,
But you never know.
based on what just happened in this presentation, it's gruesome material, right? But you've obviously done an extraordinary amount of work, and I'm looking, like you're dealing with dictators. These are important books, and especially for my students, because this is a topic area that my students are very, very interested in. So that said, everybody, we've got some time for questions. I'm going to put in the chat box, by the way, just some information. So I think, but I'm ready for questions. If anyone, and Laszlo's presentation should generate some questions. The first thing I'm putting in the chat box is the link for Dr. Papp's talk coming up on Wednesday, and then I'll follow up with the talk that comes on March 5th, just so you have that information. Otherwise, it's all on the website. And I'm sure many of you subscribe to our newsletter and events announcement. So over to my nice audience. I don't know who's out there, but I'm all set here. It's that moment, Laszlo, even when you're in person, when someone has to, get the ball rolling. So I'm just going to take a little pause here now, because in this case, people have to type the questions out. Okay. Laszlo, that's pretty quiet in Zoomville, isn't it? So I'll start then. Okay, Laszlo, just to get, the presentation doesn't, right, I can tell what's happening. If we were sitting in a room together, you'd tell, because what you've told us is, it's bone chilling, and it's extreme. A lot of what we just heard is gruesome. You mentioned towards the end, you were talking about this when you look at these party members, there's no set format, right? Do you follow me? They're not poor, they're not rich. Some are poor, some are rich. Some went bankrupt, some didn't go bankrupt. So you're basically saying there's no conclusions we can draw about membership, right? Is that something when you look at other parties of that type across Central and Eastern Europe, does that hold true as well? That there's no set type?
I think it does. I think it does. I mean, it has been shown about Austria, about Germany, and other parties that there's no rule for who would join. It's definitely true. And it has been shown for the Eurocross membership in Hungary that, contrary to the common belief, these are not riffraff. And one of the guys, Kreutz, I mentioned, actually, he was the son of a diplomat who served in Helsinki and got a very good education. And sometimes was able to see what they found on the person. And one person had a very nice library. I mean, library of classics.
Interesting.
They're not illiterate. I can see two questions from Susan. What was your motivation to write this book? I gave classes on these topics in Indiana, and the students' feedback were very good. And they pointed out that what makes them stand out from other similar classes is the personal experience from somebody who has lived in a dictatorship,
right?
That you bring. And then it's a little bit of course, intellectual curiosity. I was always interested in this. Lots of good stuff out there, and some family history also. Another question from David.
David, before, by the way, Laszlo, just so you know, David's a former student and a dear friend, and you've met him before. I sent him a note this morning saying, "Hey, Borhi's in town." a talk, and he immediately signed up. So that's David Katayo, an excellent person.
So yeah, his question is, what role did pre-war social status play in whether these Eurocross members were able to survive post-war communist purges and rise in the Stalin industry? That's a great question. A large role, because Rákosi and Révai decided that so-called working class types, working class small fry, was meaningless because the small fry was sometimes worse than the upper echelons, because this was the small fry, so-called small fry, that committed these atrocities. But small fry and working class status motivated, were the type of guys that the communists consciously recruited into their ranks. By the way, not just in Hungary, but also in Romania. In Romania, they recruited Iron Guard people. And the Austrian Communist Party also was interested in the recruitment of former Nazis. But in Hungary, this was the Arrow Cross. And the great question, they looked at social status. So working class Arrow Cross was redeemable. So they, you had to sign, of course, this could be easily blackmailed, because they signed a document when they entered that I want to rectify my sins that I committed as an Arrow Cross by joining the Communist Party. So they basically signed away their independence in joining up, but that's the way. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we got 2 questions, Laszlo. I guess that's better than no questions. I'm appealing to my audience, because if Laszlo and I are just going to have a conversation, we can do that on the telephone. But I'm happy to take a few more questions, because we do have about 15 more minutes. And then Laszlo, probably, I would like to get your, to change, but I was going to leave that for the end and just get your sense of, how this plays out in Hungarian contemporary political life. Because, when I think of Hungarian contemporary political life, the past is never that far behind you.
No.
If you follow me. So if you want to comment on that, because you've done some research that has often made it into the mainstream media in Hungary. So I'm going to leave that for a second, because I've got another great question from Dr. Susan Papp. So, but I want to come back to that, if you don't mind, Laszlo. If you don't mind, if that's all right. So I'm going to just read Susan Papp's question, okay? There have been studies and films about the guards at the Daesh demonstrating that they had little education, were looking for status. Is that generally true? You may have answered already in part.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a good question.
More to say.
It's a very small cohort. And some of them, they sure had very little education, but when we look at the Arrow Cross, it's a much larger cohort. So some of the guards in Recsk, I don't, I've looked at published material on this. I haven't researched Recsk or the guards there, but what I've seen is that, yeah, I mean, some of them were poorly educated. But it's not a rule for people who entered the totalitarian movements to be undereducated. Not at all, not in the least. So what scholars have come about the Arrow Cross or rank and file Communist Party members, it's not necessarily at all the undereducated. Some of them were, but it's not the rule. I don't think it's the. My personal opinion is that's not a rule. So education did not give you a free pass. Rob's question, in fact, and on the verge of publishing an article on this topic right now. They just came out with a documentary done in a great haste on 1944 and the Arrow Cross terror.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at it. It's very politicized. And unfortunately, factually, sometimes quite incorrect. Some good footage there. But I would not have used these victims of horrendous crimes for political gain. I don't like that. I never want to use my scholarship for political purposes. This particular documentary is very close to that, unfortunately, and leaves certain things unsaid which should be said. So it's political. You're right. I mean, it's very political. I think it is possible to write academically sound scholarship but it can and will be. I mean, both Nazi and communist crimes, unfortunately, are instrumentalized by both political spectrums, both the right and the left, for their own ends, and to whip up popular support, I should say,
Right.
for that political spectrum. So both sides do it. I don't think it should be done, but for generations to come. Nina Monk has a question in terms of
Yeah, go for it,
research.
Laszlo, but do me a favor, put that, I didn't catch, I have a recording, but if you get a chance or send me email, I didn't catch the name of the documentary, if you can put it in the chat box,
I can look it up, yeah.
okay.
In terms of your research, which archives have been most critical to you? Which provided the most eye-opening material or altered the direction of research? It's a great question, very good, thank you so much for that. The State Security Archives in Budapest contain a part, or the major part, of the documentation of the so-called Eurocross trials. Also, the Budapest Fővárosi Levéltár, Budapest Municipal Archives have some material, and I compared the two. What was very interesting is that sometimes you had the same witnesses testifying in 1945 or 46 in the case of the same perpetrators, and as the ones testifying 20 years later. So you can compare what the witnesses, the former victims or former perpetrators said immediately after the war, and let's say in the mid or late 60s or the early 70s. So both are very useful. Also, the Hungarian National Archives, I have to say that these are all absolutely open for research. The archivists were very, very helpful and very, very well trained. So they have given me a lot of assistance. I mean, if you're alone, it's very hard, but these archives are well organized, the archivists are very, very ready to help. What I found is beyond imagination, though. I mean, I knew about this partly because of my family history, but not even scholars were aware of this. I mean, this is just coming out right now. And as I said, I just came up with an article. I did not want to do an article before the book came out, but I just did, to be published in Hungarian shortly, I hope. So anyway, it's beyond imagination. I mean, in the mostly in the negative sense. The positive sense was the large-scale effort to save people.
Mhm.
That was the nice part. Another question, Cordial Farkas, what average citizens of Hungary knew about what happened under Stalinistic states of Eastern Europe, how accurate, distorted that knowledge was? It's a great question. Zero zip. All of this was buried in oblivion. Archives are not available for research, particularly on post-1945 history. They were closed. And it was partly written history. It was not academic history for a long time. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it began to change. But this particular topic was basically a taboo. It was not something that you could write about. Of course, after the regime change, yes. But Holocaust research focused until quite recently mainly on its political history. There has been a historiographical turn. Gábor Gyány is one of the driving forces in Hungary of a victim/perpetrator-oriented approach, and more of a social history of the Holocaust. And the Eurocross stuff is just coming out, so that is now going to see a lot of attention, and that is why about 120 pages of my book focuses on that particular chapter, because it's very new. And it ties very, very well into historical discourse on the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. I mean, again, this perpetrator and victim-oriented approach of the Holocaust, victim-oriented.
Laszlo, you've got the question, contemporary question that you can see. What is life today for the roughly 100,000 Jews in Hungary?
I cannot speak for them all. I can tell you a personal, I mean, Rob started with, and again, I'm not speaking for everybody, but Rob started with a personal story. Let me tell you a personal story. I was walking around in Budapest a couple of years ago, and I could see a rabbi coming unexpectedly showing up, and he shouts at me in broken Hungarian, said, "You Jew, you are." And he came up and repeated the question, "Jew, you are you a Jew?" Vacillated a little, and I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am." And it turned out that he's from Chabad. They set up shop in the 7th district of Budapest. They walk around in their kaftans. And he introduced me to the Jewish religion a little bit, my children. And sometimes we hang out for coffee. I mean, he's very observant. And 2 years ago, I was there in the summer in the 7th district, which is now seeing its revival as the former Jewish district of the city. And there's a coffee house called Tel Aviv. He invited me for coffee there. And after we had our coffee and conversation, he gave me a blessing, a Jewish blessing with all the trappings of that. And then in the next table, 2 women were sitting, conversing in English. And when this whole thing was over, one of them says, "We're from Amsterdam. And you know what? I'm Jewish." The other lady at the table was not Jewish, but one of them was. She said our family fled from Poland in 68, you know, Polish anti-Semitic stuff in Poland in 68. And you know what he says? You can do this in Budapest. This is not fun. I would never dare do this in Holland. He said, "My children are going to a secular school because I'm too scared to send them to a Jewish school." She said it's unheard of. You would get harassed for that. So I think it's gotten much better. But again, it's my personal experience. A question about
Hang on, Laszlo, you've got a question that came ahead, which came to my email because there was a problem. So I'm going to go to that question. Do you mind, Laszlo?
Let me go to this one on my screen, Rob.
Sure.
Push back against deportations until July 45. And the church is very ambivalent, though, I have to say. The Catholic Church as such did not oppose or speak up against deportations, and when they did, they usually spoke up for converts. Having said that, for instance, the Salesians, the Sisters of Divine Love, and other orders, nuns mainly, made very heroic efforts to save people, but and it was more of a personal effort than an organized effort, as far as I know. Definitely not against the Arrow Cross did. When the Arrow Cross deported, it was a very difficult situation, but there was no resistance as such from the part of the Hungarian churches. There were individual, Vilmos Apor, for instance, the Bishop of Győr, spoke up openly against it, but he was more of an exception than the rule. Of course, what is bad about his fate was that he was shot by Soviet troops when he wanted to save some women from getting raped. But there was no concentrated, concerted effort, as far as I know, from the part of the Catholic Church. There are researchers of this topic. One of them is, if you're interested, and send me an email, I can put you in touch. An outstanding scholar, Margit Balog, who has done a huge bio on Cardinal Mindszenty, and she can direct you to further information about that. Rob, your question?
I'm just trying I'm trying to look at too many screens now, but Laszlo, people are using my email, which is fine because I know them. And this is from actually a very close friend and someone you know quite well. I'm curious about your thoughts on individual agency versus structures. Today, there is a great discussion of structural implicit bias in society across many domains. Any lessons or reflections from your historical work on today's dialogue, restructures versus individual agency?
Yes. Individual actions are not, I do not think, are primarily determined by structure. I'm convinced that somebody's individual outlook is not determined by birth, whether racial or class. And I'm convinced that even, look, I've looked at the worst part of the camp life, which is when the Hungarian Jews were taken, because that was the end, that was the worst, that was the worst. And there was so much hostility from camp veterans towards the new arrivals. And survival was so selfish And I looked at capos, and even Nicholas Waxman, who's done a wonderful book on the Holocaust, a wonderful book, I am truly admire it. But his take on the capos, I looked at the Dagob material, that is survival testimonies from 45, 5,000. I looked at thousands of testimonies, and you know what? There's no excuse for capos, because what capos did, the way that capos tortured prisoners, went way beyond the need of self-preservation, way beyond. I mean, not even the SS required a capo or an Aufseher, and many of them were women, to bludgeon a prisoner to death. They did it for pleasure. They did it for pleasure. And also, there was no punishment for acting humanely. I did not find a single instance in the survival testimonies which said such and such a capo or guard was decent, and for that reason he was or she was punished. No, never. And there are memoirs even of Lagerführers who behaved. One of them was called Daddy because he actually cared for his prisoners. A woman said, I was almost collapsing. I couldn't dig anymore. And an SS man came up, but not to shoot me or hit me in the head. He took my shovel and did my work for me. It was possible. You don't have to be that incredibly cruel. And the same with the, as I mentioned in my talk, you didn't have to denounce. You didn't have to denounce. You did not have to kill. There was, even in the Morrow Street Hospital, there was at least one person who remained human. You could go against the grain. It was possible. And you could take, people did take the moral choice ahead of self-preservation. I've seen many instances where somebody was hiding people in a kitchen and room, and that person, there was a guy called Mátyás Frölich who was murdered for that. But many others also. István Deák actually mentions a couple housekeepers who were shot by the Arrow Cross for helping a resistance unit in his book on Europe on Trial. Very good book, excellent book.
It's an amazing book.
But this is my answer to this. I believe in individual responsibility and individual agency, and my research. No, look, I'm not saying that these were not terrible times, and people, and that's the other part of my research. To be honest and fair, these are horrendous. I mean, even if I look at Rákosi's Hungary, I mean, the number of informants that they had, the types of imaginary crimes that could hand hundreds of people ended up in the gallows for imagined crimes, for crimes they never committed. So these are very, very difficult. So this is why I wrote about it, because when I speak about this to my students in the US, it's impossible for them to understand that even when you're in a neutral, safe situation like a classroom, you could get into trouble in a Nazi or Stalinist setting, because there were always informants there. And the number of informants in a Stalinist society was multitudes larger than in Nazi Germany. So all of these situations are incredibly harsh. But for instance, two sisters, they were denouncing one another for the inheritance, family inheritance. One sister to the Nazis, and then the other sister after the war to the communists. And in 1948, there was a trial. Both sisters brought more mortal danger on the other, mortal danger, just to get the father's house. And the judge said very wisely in 48, you are both acquitted, and both of you know how to manipulate the levers of power. So that's the other part of the story, you know. So this is not an easy question by any measure. This is one of the toughest questions you can ask. And thank you for it. Thank you very much.
Laszlo, we're going, Anna Porter sent me a question, and then, but when you're talking about that documentary you're referring to, that's the documentary on the Morrow Street Massacre, right?
Yeah.
Because by the way, that was sent to me by one of my students. I've already watched it, but we'll pick that up after, because And Anna also wants to hear more of your thoughts on that, but maybe the three of us can talk about that documentary separately, all right?
Yeah, we could talk about that separately. I didn't like it one bit.
Yeah, with only a few minutes, I'll pick it up with you after, but I want to take Cornell's question here because it speaks to some of your other earlier work regarding, I'll read it again. In the 1939 Hungarian national election, the Arrow Cross Party won more than 25% of the vote. Subsequently became Hungary's most important opposition party. The party's foreign policy was faithfully pro-Nazi. Despite this, it was not included in Hungary's pro-Nazi government, even after Germany occupied Hungary in March 1944. And this is a really question, speaks to Horthy. Why were they not involved?
Okay, so this is a good question and more complicated than it sounds, because
the
Arrow Cross was not unilaterally pro-German. In fact, Szálasi was mad that Horthy allowed, Laszlo Borhi has a great bio on him, that Horthy allowed Hungary's Jews to be deported, because these are our Jews, he says. We can use them in Hungary, why give them to the Germans? So when he came to power, he insisted that he was only loaning the laborers to Germany, not giving them. And he fully expected them to come back. Now, there were a nationalist like the Arrow Cross. They had cross purposes with the German nationalists, right? Because the Nazis proclaimed that they're superior. Of course, there were crackpots in Hungary, like Bakai, who were pro-Hitler. But there was, and it's not a coincidence that some of the people who were actually executed by the Arrow Cross for anti-German resistance, Barcsi, Zsilinszky, or Lendvai, were racial protectionists. And why did not Hitler want them in power? Because he wanted reliable. He didn't want the mad, the crazies. He didn't want them in Romania. He didn't want the Iron God in Romania. He was very happy with Antonescu. And he only kicked out Horthy when he found out that he was getting ready to jump out of the war. But he did not necessarily wanted the most crazy people. He wanted people who did the services, who sent the army, who sent the economic stuff, but not necessarily the crazies. But that's a very good question. And in 1939, the Hungarian conservative elite, Betlen, Teleki, Horthy, saw themselves vindicated, because the reason why suffrage was limited to 25% of the population in 1920 or 21, down from 40%, is because they feared that if you give them universal suffrage, they will vote for a radical party. And that's precisely what happened in 1939. And by then, the Social Democrats' popularity began to decline. The Social Democrats were quite popular in the 1920s. And in fact, I have to tell you that there are quite a few Arrow Cross who had been Social Democrats or communists. One of my worst killers, Janura Lajos, was first in the Communist Party, and then he went over to the Arrow Cross. But quite a few of them were Social Democrats, but the Social Democrats were losing their popularity by the end of the 1930s.
Laszlo, this was an extremely important morning and early afternoon for all of us, and I thank you very much. We're at about 12:29 here. Laszlo, we'll be together again soon. I'm pretty certain of that, either via Zoom, but I feel that we'll be together certainly in the fall, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. I really hope. And thank you very much for the participation. And all of them were great questions. Thank you for that.
Really great questions. And I'll follow up because on the documentary, and then we can take it from there. But let me just remind everyone in the chat box, we've got Dr. Pap's talk next week. And next week, I'll tell you about the next talk so it doesn't get too cluttered in there. So because we have a talk on March 5th. So Wednesday, hopefully you can join us at 2 p.m. where Dr. Pap's going to present an aspect of her recent dissertation. And let me say, thanks to Laszlo, obviously. And thanks also, I neglected to mention that one of our sponsors is the Hungarian Research Institute of Canada, which I'm a member, and so is Dr. Pap, and Cornel Farkas was asking good questions, and Professor Levante Dioshadi, an old friend of all of ours, is a big supporter of this. So special thanks to them, and they'll be our sponsors next week, everybody. So, having said all that, it is Friday in Toronto, and I wish everyone a great weekend, and there's nothing more to be said. Laszlo, we'll talk by email, okay?
So you want to stay on the line now, or shall we Just
No, I'm gonna just send you a separate email and set something up with Anna, okay? Because I'm gonna write to Anna right now. Because
for when?
I'd like to do it via Zoom with me, you, and Anna, so I'll set something up later, okay?
Okay, all right.
And best, before I forget, best regards to your wife and your 2 boys.
Oh, thank you, and same to you then.
Yeah, we're
Look,
lucky. Kate lives in Kingston, which is a green zone, and Andrew's in New Brunswick, as I mentioned. And
Wow.
things like the East are a little bit better than here.
good.
Thanks,
Good,
everybody. Have a great weekend. Thanks so much
Same
for.
to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.